Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We'll make a start. My name's Jeremy, and I'll be leading these sessions this month. We've got 5 sessions, Monday nights. So we've got 5 hours to cover some interesting topics, have some good discussions. So these sessions, probably many of you have been to them before, but the idea of these is just to present some Buddhist practices and ideas, and particularly practices that are very practical, that we can immediately put into practice in our daily life. And unfortunately, I'm not an enlightened being. Unfortunately for you, I'm just an ordinary person. So I don't. Apparently, the Buddhas can sort of look into your mind and teach you whatever you need to know. That I don't have that ability, unfortunately. So I just talk about practices that I've found useful, and hopefully you will too. So I thought this month I particularly focus on practices which are called mindfulness, introspection, and application. There's various terms used, ways that they're translated, and I'll explain them in more detail. So I'll just present these practices and ideas, and as the Buddha said, he encouraged people to challenge his ideas, not to accept them. He said it should be like buying a lump of gold in the marketplace. You should, before you agree to buy, you should test it thoroughly by melting it and scratching it and beating it. And so before you accept any of these ideas, you're encouraged to interrogate them and challenge them. So we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So as I'm going through, if there's anything I say that you disagree with, just make a mental note of it and feel free to raise that in the discussion time. It's probably the best way to learn this kind of material, I think, by having discussion. And also we learn from each other. Everyone's got a different perspective, and you can be quite surprised by people have a very different understanding of the ideas, which you have one idea and someone has a completely different idea. So it's a very good way to learn. You notice in the monastic institutions in the Himalayan countries, for example, they spend many hours every day doing this debate practice where they clap their hands and there's one person sitting down defending their position and the other person's attacking their position. So it's a logical debate regarded as the best way to gain insight into these ideas. And there's many ideas, thousands. So you can see these texts on one side, that's the Buddha's teachings, or the sort of the canon, and then on the other side is the commentary by later Indian and Tibetan masters. And the Buddha is said to have taught 84,000 teachings on for ways of pacifying the 84,000 mental afflictions. Don't ask me to name them. I think the 84,000 divided to there's 21 that relate sort of to anger, and then 21,000, and then 21,000 relating to attachment, and then 21,000 relating to what's called ignorance or wrong view, and then I think the fourth 21,000 category is sort of they're relating to all 3 of those, something like that. Okay, so important not to feel overwhelmed when you're told that you have 84,000 delusions. That's a little bit daunting. So we just start with, the advice is to start with the ones that are most bothering you. So the thing that the affliction, or we call them afflictions, mental afflictions, or afflictive states of mind, or sometimes they're referred to as delusions. So the advice is to start with the one that's bothering you the most. I think probably when I first became interested in Buddhism, I think probably depression was something that was bothering me. And then later on I think it became anger. And then maybe after that attachment. And now I think it might be laziness. Yeah. So we've all got it'd be interesting to go around the room and ask, what do you think your most powerful affliction is? It'd be a bit embarrassing, but apparently that's what the yogis do when they're meditating up in the mountains, and they come out of meditation and they say, what's your most powerful affliction? We'll chat about it. So it's important not to feel bad about these mental afflictions that we have in our mind. We all have them. We didn't ask to have them. They just come up. And so I think it's very important to, when you start to investigate your mind and you become aware of these afflictions, that you don't feel despondent, because I think that can happen. Some people say, I think Damien, you probably know, said he jokes that he thought he was quite a good person until he started meditating. So it can be a bit of a shock when you start to investigate your mind and seeing what's going on in there. But so it's important to think, well, they're just thoughts. They just arise in the mind. They come and go, and they arise because of certain causes and conditions. And to not think that this is me, that I am angry, I'm anger, I'm an angry person, or I'm, whatever it is. So you just think of, the idea is to think of your mind as being like the sky, being spacious and open, and that these thoughts coming up are just like the clouds passing through the sky. So they're not the sky, they're just something that's passing through. So they're impermanent, and they arise because of causes and conditions, and then they abide for a while, and then eventually they dissipate, they fade away. So it's helpful to think of them like that, because I think sometimes we have this tendency to think that I'm sort of inherently angry, or I'm inherently anxious, or that this thing is, I'm stuck with these afflictive emotions, there's nothing I can do about them, and that can be very depressing. But if you think of it as just something that's arising in your mind, this is not me, this is just something that's coming up, and it's going to pass. That's a very helpful way to think of it. So we'll spend this month just thinking and talking about these ideas and practices that we can use to address these various afflictive emotions. Emotions is not actually the correct word, strictly speaking, in Buddhist terminology, because they're not all emotions. This includes things like pride, which is more like an attitude or a misunderstanding, or anyway, I'll call them afflictions. Okay. So what we find, or the idea is that the mind is, as I said, is basically kind of, I guess you'd say like pure and clear. And there's these things that arise, these afflictions arise up. So the idea is that by overcoming them, or firstly we try to pacify them, sort of reduce their strength or their power, and then by pacifying them slowly, our mind becomes clearer, more clearer. So the idea is that mind is sort of basically like clear, and the analogy is used of like clear water, and then the afflictive emotions are like the currents which are disturbing the water and disturbing the silt, making it become cloudy and stirring up the silt. So by pacifying the mind, then it sort of settles down and becomes clear. So that's an idea that you might like to challenge, whether you agree with that idea of the mind. I think some people would definitely disagree with that. Okay, so we'll do some meditation in each session. And in the meditation, I particularly want to make clear these three tools of mindfulness, introspection and application. So I'll repeat them a few times. would be really, I think these are really key points to understand. And if we're interested in training our mind, developing our mind, and overcoming these afflictive emotions, then we really need these 3 tools. I don't think we can do it without them. And meditators often describe, like Geshe Doga, the resident teacher, he often describes them as his 3 best friends, because he says that by having these in his mind he can remain happy all the time. And so he's sort of implying that they're more reliable than his other friends, which don't, maybe like us, that don't really make him happy all the time. But so yeah, that's the idea, that if we have these tools in our mind, we firstly identify them, and then we develop them, become familiar with them, and gradually they just become part of our way of thinking. So they're sort of active all the time. So all the time you're using introspection to observe what's going on in your mind. You're always aware of what's going on. And then application, as soon as the affliction arises, like irritation or attachment or depression, then you can immediately apply a practice, remedial practice to deal with that, to pacify that, to confront that. Alright, so we'll do some meditation now. Firstly, it's good to be clear what is meditation. So you probably all know, but different people have different ideas about what meditation is. So in this context, the meditation is defined as familiarizing your mind with a positive object, or also a neutral object. So positive means something that has a positive effect on your mind. So we're talking about a mental object here, not a physical object. So familiarizing your mind with a positive mental object. So an example would be compassion. So compassion is the thought wishing that to free others from suffering. Or love, wishing others to be happy. So they're examples of positive mental objects. So meditation on those would be familiarizing your mind with the attitude or thoughts of love and compassion. So that would be meditation on compassion. So just by bringing it to mind, then slowly our mind becomes more familiar with it, and by becoming more familiar, then it builds up sort of strength and becomes more sort of prevalent, I guess, in your mind, and easier to recall, to bring to mind. And we find that same with negative thoughts. So by focusing on negative thoughts a lot, we find that they come up more easily, and they can be more overwhelming. So a practice like introspection and mindfulness, for example, we can find our mind dwelling on some negative thought, something that's disturbing our mind, like, for example, something that someone did to us 10 years ago and we're getting really angry about it, or even something that someone might do to us in the future. And then you notice with introspection, you notice that your mind is doing that, and then with application you apply the remedial practice like patience. So we'll talk more about that. So that's what meditation is, familiarizing your mind with a positive or neutral object. So in this meditation we'll be meditating on the breath, which is a neutral object. It's neither positive nor negative, it's just neutral. And so the purpose of familiarizing your mind with a neutral object is just to pacify particularly discursive thoughts. So discursive thoughts means that our mind is constantly jumping from one mental object to another. And you notice that when you try to focus on one thing, that your mind is always jumping from one thing to another. And we call that the monkey mind, because it's like a monkey that's always never stops, it's just jumping around all the time. So that's one of the things that we need to overcome to develop concentration and meditation. So it's recommended focusing on a neutral object to do that. Alright, so just sit in a posture, firstly, that helps you to concentrate. whatever is comfortable for you. But normally people find it better to sit with their back straight, because that stops you from getting drowsy, and said to allow the energy to move more freely in your body. So we're trying to remain alert is one of the main goals of meditation. So we're trying to avoid sleepiness. So most people find it helpful to have your eyes mostly closed, but also a little bit open to let in some light so you don't get sleepy. Some people prefer to meditate with their eyes wide open, so that's up to you. Can be helpful to sit cross-legged like this, but also sitting in a chair is fine. Some people I quite like meditating when I'm lying down, but I tend to fall asleep. But anyway, whatever works for you. Then just bring your attention to your mind. Firstly just relax your body, think about your body, and just make sure it's relaxed, but also alert or awake. And then think about your mind. What is your mind doing? So our minds are generally busy with all the things that have been going on during the day and things that are going on in our life. All the activities that we're involved in, all the relationships, all the things that we're trying to achieve, all the things that are getting in the way of achieving those. So these are all the things that our mind is busy with. So it can be helpful just to make a decision. Okay, I'm going to stop thinking about those things right now. Have a break. And even give yourself permission. It's okay to stop thinking about those things. You don't have to think about them all the time. It's fine to give your mind a holiday, vacation. So, okay, I'm going to stop thinking about all those things. They can wait. And then bring your attention to your breath. And just observe your breath moving in and out. So this is a neutral object. It doesn't generate attachment or aversion. So this might be a really welcome break from the busyness that your mind is normally occupied with. You could find it really restful just to stop thinking about all those things, even for a few minutes. So the idea is not that we're trying to force our mind to focus on this thing, but it's more like maybe like allowing our mind or relaxing our mind onto the object. Just resting your mind on the object, maybe. So just allow your mind to settle, focus on the breath moving in and out. And it can be helpful to focus particularly on the point just under the tip of your nose. I think a mind, with concentration, a mind finds it easier if it's a sort of a smaller point to focus on. Like a point rather than something vague like the breath. So you're still focusing on the breath, but you're just focusing on the point of the breath moving in and out past that point under the tip of your nose. Okay, so this is the object we've chosen to focus on. So choosing to focus on an object is what we call mindfulness, also sometimes called remembering. So you're remembering to keep this object in mind. So because your mind has a tendency to want to wander off and think about lots of other things, we're remembering, no, that for these few minutes I'm just going to focus on this one thing. So you're telling your mind that. So part of your mind is having a conversation with the other part. Maybe it's a bit like a parent and a child. The child wants to run around and play and do lots of things, but the parent is saying, no, we're just going to focus on this one point for the time being. So that's mindfulness. And then introspection is observing whether the mind is staying on the object or has wandered off. So it's watching how the meditation's going. And then when the mind wanders off, it brings it back to that point. So when you find that your mind's wandered off and you bring it back, it's important not to get frustrated or disappointed. So you just notice that it's happening and you move it back. And that's part of the meditation. Replacing your concentration on the object. Now it can be helpful to count the breaths. I find that helpful. So breathing in and out is one breath. So just count your breaths as you're going along and see how long you can remain focused. And it can also help to notice when your mind has wandered and you've lost count, then you can start again. So try counting the breaths. just check if your mind is wandering off. And if it is, just bring it back to that point. So that's alertness, observing the mind, bringing it back to that point. Just place it on that point of concentration. So just for a few minutes, a few more minutes, we'll do this and try to make a concerted effort to keep your mind focused just for the next few minutes. So being particularly aware of mindfulness and alertness, being aware of what your mind is doing, and being alert to, as soon as it starts to wander off, to return it to that point. Okay, just relax your concentration. So, do you have any comments or questions about that meditation practice? You don't have to have any, but feel free to ask if you do. Yes, Ingrid.
Part of the mind that's counting, would you say that was part of the mindfulness or part of the alertness? The object is the breath.
Good question. Maybe it's a third thing, a fourth thing. Yeah, so mindfulness is remembering the object, which is the breath. Alertness is observing whether it's moving away or staying on the object. So maybe it's a part of the alertness.
Is alertness the same as introspection?
Sorry, say that again?
Is alertness the same as introspection?
Yes, I'm using those two terms interchangeably here. Yes. Yep, sorry. I think introspection is probably a better term. So we have this problem with translating Buddhist terminology. It's still a work in progress, I would say. And like the term mindfulness, you hear used in many different ways, but using a particular meaning in this. So yeah, we'll stick with introspection. That sounds like you're looking inwards, observing what your mind is doing, yeah. Maybe alertness is part of that because you're sort of alert to what's happening. So you're ready to move your mind back onto the other.
I understand the link. Why would you link the counting with the alertness? It seemed to me that the mindfulness is, well, based on what you were saying, I'm trying to identify as I was doing it.
Yeah.
The mindfulness is the focus on the breath.
Yep. That's the holding the object, remembering the object. Yep.
And I thought that the counting was just an alarm system for the introspection to kick in.
Maybe the counting is part of the object. Not sure. Do you find the counting helpful? No. Okay. Okay, that's fine.
I found it really helpful.
You did?
I could only get to like 6 at first and then the second set.
Okay.
I really concentrated and got to like 10.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wasn't very good
Yeah.
at it.
No, that's
But
but
to like really low numbers sometimes, you're like, yeah, wow, I'm not concentrating.
yeah. So I guess it can help to show how much concentration you have or how little you have. But I guess it could also be a distraction. Yeah. So that's fine. And as I was saying, everyone's different. Sorry.
So I've got a couple of things going on here. I think counting is distracting.
Yeah. Okay.
I think initially we're just trying to find some stillness here.
Yep.
So I think the definition of mindfulness really is about being non-judgmental.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so
Did everyone hear that? Mindfulness. You're saying that the term mindfulness should be meaning non-judgmental.
well, one of the, this, as you said, there's several definitions.
Yeah.
But one of the main ones is moment-to-moment awareness, non-judgmentally
Yeah.
in the present moment.
Yeah.
So
Good.
if you're trying to get a focus of counting, and then you judge yourself because there's too much judging going on.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I take that point. And I think that's something we need to be careful of and try to avoid, because I think we have a tendency to... there's one Lama who calls it spiritual materialism, and I think we all do that. It's sort of like we've set this goal for ourselves and we want to achieve it. We want to be a good meditator or sort of thing. And then we get frustrated. Oh, I'm not a good meditator. Oh, I'm doing really badly today. My mind is just hopeless, jumping around. So I think we have to be careful of that. And as you say, that you like dial down the judgment. Because it's not about being good or bad, or about being a good meditator or a bad meditator. It's just about observing what's happening in the mind. And an interesting meditation, which is probably a bit like what you're talking about, is just to observe whatever's coming up in the mind. So you could be observing anger coming up. Like you could be having all these thoughts of anger about something somebody did to you or this person. And a practice is just to observe that emotion. And so instead of getting involved in it, and instead of thinking about all the bad things that person did, you're just observing the thoughts sort of in an objective way and in a non-judgmental way. And that practice is said to, in itself, to pacify those afflictions, because you're not adding fuel to the fire, you're just observing them. So that sounds a bit like what you're talking about with non-judgment. Is it, maybe?
Well, I think we need, for ourselves, we need so much compassion.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so it's not easy for people at the moment. I think the practice of self-compassion is more beneficial
Yeah,
than being judgmental.
yeah. So maybe you could look at it like this. So we, as you say, we've got so much going on in our lives, all of us, all the time. As an act of compassion for yourself, you can give yourself a break from thinking about all this stuff all the time. That's like a holiday, like going to a day spa for your mind. You're just going to give yourself 5 minutes. I'm going to stop thinking about all that stuff and just have a break. So yeah, that could be an act of compassion for yourself. I think it is. And as you say, we need to be careful about the judgment, saying, oh, I'm doing such a bad job at this, or my mind is so crazy today. This kind of thoughts are just not really helping us. So. But yeah, sorry, you had a question?
I'm just interested in something you said a second ago about like observing what comes up in the mind. So you use like anger as an example.
Yeah.
How would you, like what would you do with that? Like how would you meditate on anger? Like observing what's going on and what would you do with that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think that is a little bit tricky, that practice, and probably generally regarded as a bit sort of more advanced than the one of focusing on your breath. Because the breath is fairly simple and we can clearly identify the object. But when we're meditating on something like an emotion, that it's sort of something that's moving and changing, and it's quite hard not to get involved in the emotion. But I think you can understand the sort of idea of it, a bit like observing a wave, rising and then dissipating. So you're not really getting involved in the wave, you're not riding the wave, you're just observing it from a distance. So that's the idea, that it's possible to use our mind in that way and use that. So the object there is the emotion. So maybe we could try that. I'm trying to think of a good example. So you could use happiness as an example, or you could take any emotion. What would be a good emotion to try? Anger might be a bit disturbing. Maybe a sort of neutral-ish one. Gratitude. All right, let's try that. So can you think of someone that you feel grateful to, or even something you're grateful to for? Grateful for maybe your parents, some of the nice things that they did for you as a child. They cooked you how many meals, fed you for 15 or 20 years. So, or anything, just something someone has done, kind thing someone has done for you. Even saying something nice or giving you something. So just allow that feeling of gratitude to arise up in your mind. and then just observe that. So in this case, the object of meditation is that feeling of gratitude. So then I guess the question is, can we observe it without getting involved in it? Because with a negative, disturbing thought, we don't want to get more involved and disturb our minds more. We just want to sort of observe it, and then by just merely observing it, as you say, non-judgmentally, and then just allow it to dissipate without upsetting us. That's the idea. I think that's quite tricky, but I can see that it's possible. I think I've been able to do that sometimes. Maybe not with maybe with strong emotions like anger. Because sometimes you have sort of low-level anger that's sort of simmering, and you can just sort of observe it. Instead of thinking about the causes of the anger, that thing that the person did, you just focus on the sensation, I guess, or the feeling of anger. Mm. Another interesting, similar practice is just to observe what your mind is doing. So with that meditation we did before, we were trying to hold the mind onto one object. Another practice is said just to let your mind do whatever it wants to do, which is said to be like watching a bird flying around. And you just observe it. And it's said, the analogy is used, a bird in the middle of on a ship in the middle of an ocean, it'll fly off in all different directions. Eventually it realizes nowhere to go, so it'll just end up sitting. So the idea with that practice is you just let your mind wander around and do whatever it wants to do, and you just observe it doing that, and then, but not getting involved in it, and then eventually your mind will just sort of calm down and stop flying around. So that's another way of... So again, we're using still the same tools, mindfulness. So in that case, the object is just the mind moving around, and alertness is seeing whether your mind is focusing on the object or whether it's maybe getting too involved in the emotion. So that would be part of the alertness and introspection.
So just to follow up,
Yeah.
focus on the emotion itself rather than the thoughts that arise from it.
Yeah, the emotion itself rather than the causes of the feeling of anger. So normally with anger we're focusing on that thing that's making us angry, that word that the person said, or whatever they did, or whatever. So we're focusing on that, and then this anger's coming up. So you change the focus to the anger, the feeling of anger itself. That's an interesting technique. Yes?
This may not be relevant, but I guess it's one thing to be sitting and meditating, but when day to day when anger arises or grief or the practice to be able to take those moments. Do you have any offerings as to applying them in the moment? You can't quite take yourself off to sit down and meditate in silence.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the idea here is that the formal sitting practice is where we sort of really focused, and if we can find time, even 10 minutes a day, and by focusing sort of more intensely, we familiarize our minds with these mental tools of mindfulness and introspection and application. And then the idea is that by becoming more and more familiar, then it's more easy to use them in our day-to-day life. So we don't have to be sitting quietly in a quiet place with our eyes closed. We can use these tools and eventually use them in every moment of our life. So we're constantly watching what's going on in the mind, and we're constantly applying various techniques. When we feel a strong anger or attachment arising, then we use these techniques. So we become very familiar with the techniques for dealing with them as well. That's the idea. And even eventually people apparently can do it in their sleep. So they're having dreams, and in the dream there's some anger arising, and then they sort of use this technique to pacify the anger. So that's the idea, just familiarization. Yeah. And some people say, well, that's just like, brainwashing yourself and turning yourself into a robot or something. So I think the Buddhist response to that would be, at the moment our minds tend to be controlled and overwhelmed by these afflictions. You take, for example, attachment and aversion. So if you observe your mind, you find that it's sort of constantly or often being pulled between being attached to, drawn towards something, and then trying to push something else away, whether it's a person or an experience or whatever. And so we constantly have this sort of battle going on, where we're trying to gather all the good stuff for this person, this I, and then push away all the bad stuff, and pull all the nice people towards us, and try and avoid the unpleasant people and push them away. So one Buddhist teacher describes that as me against the universe. So if you think it's me against the universe, then who's going to win? So it's an impossible battle. So these practices are freeing us from that constant battle. That's the idea. So the idea is to free us from these strong habitual tendencies for these to come up in our mind. And then once we're free, then once we have some control, some freedom from them, then we're more in control of our life, which is happiness, being in control of your life and your emotions, and then that's what makes us happy. We can be who we want to be, or live our life how we want to live. That's the idea. Yes, sorry.
I wonder if you might speak to a couple of times you've mentioned a feeling coming up in your mind, but the experience of when I thought of gratitude for me, it was trying to focus on what I was sensing in sort of sensations before. So
Yeah.
this sort of non-verbal space.
You mean like a physical sensation? Yeah.
Yeah, how that comes into watching that wave, I suppose.
Yeah. So I would say it's quite similar. Wouldn't you? I mean, observing a physical sensation, like often when you meditate, you have pain in your knees. So in some meditation traditions, they particularly, I think, like Japanese tradition, really strict about not moving, and sometimes they even have someone who comes around and whacks you on the back if you're slumping forward. And so then it's all about just dealing with whatever comes up. So I'm not going to flinch. I'm just going to, whatever comes up. So I've got this pain in my knees, it's burning. But I'm not going to move, I'm just going to focus on it. And similarly, it's said by focusing on these sensations, then also you can pacify them. So that's something to experiment with. But I think, it's quite similar to the emotions. There's a thing called close mindful placement on feeling, and I forget the name of the others. But do you know? There's close mindful placement on feeling, and then there's on emotion, and I think then there's one just on the mind. Anyway, we're talking about these kind of practices, and so you're sort of doing what you're saying. So one is just focusing on the sensations in your body. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not a very good Buddhist scholar.
By focusing on the sensation, for me, it helps distance from a judgment on it in a way. Thoughts have a lot of, they carry a lot of connotations, but like a sensation is kind of more neutral. Even if it's pain, it's kind of like I can't control that. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. The idea is if you can focus on something with a lot of concentration, then it changes into something else. That's the idea. Particularly something like affliction or a pain. That's really interesting. Like with pain management, for example. Okay. Thank you. That was a good discussion. So a few other things I wanted to say. So I talked a little bit about this idea of monkey mind. So you would have noticed that in your meditation before, so that the mind really wants to move around. That's kind of like our habit. And the problem with this, what we call monkey mind, is that the mind is constantly moving from one mental object to another. And some mental objects we feel, as I was saying before, drawn towards, like attachment, and we want to get closer to them. And then other mental objects we feel an aversion towards, whether it's a person or a thing or emotion or even a memory. So our mind is jumping from one mental object to the other, and if we don't have any control over that, it can just go anywhere and sort of take us anywhere, sort of thing. So we don't really have a lot of control over our experience, because what the mind is doing is affecting our experience, how we feel. So if your mind is dwelling on something that somebody bad thing they did to you a long time ago, and you're having this negative feeling, so that's sort of taking over your experience, it's making you unhappy. So if we just let the mind do that, then we're sort of out of not having control over our emotions. That's where we get this sort of roller coaster effect, where our mind can be flying high for a while, and then for some reason it just starts to go down, and we're suddenly feeling bad, unhappy, depressed, stressed, etc. So that's the problem with this, so-called monkey mind. And it's also exhausting, because having our mind pulled in different directions in each moment is also exhausting. So we're sort of losing a lot of energy. And if we can focus our mind on, these neutral or positive objects, then we're also sort of channeling our energy, so we don't get so exhausted. And another thing, I think one of the reasons why we enjoy this, or we got into this habit of this, in Buddhism it's called busy laziness. So that sounds a bit harsh, but the idea is that your mind is in our, not just our mind, our whole lives, we get involved in this staying busy just for the sake of busyness, because there's part of us that is kind of fearful of this stillness. That's the idea. And you might notice that when you try and stop and focus your mind on your breath, that there's part of your mind which really doesn't like this kind of stopping and stillness. It just wants to keep moving. And I've had people sort of get quite angry in meditation classes and walk out. This is just a waste of time. Why would I want to stop thinking? What's the point of that? One guy was saying, I get paid $150 an hour, and I don't need to stop thinking. It's just like, why would I do that? So, I understand that, but I think it's because we have this attachment to sort of busyness, what we're calling busy laziness. And I think part of that comes from fear, that we don't really want to look what's inside our mind. It's just better to stay busy. We don't really want to. We're a bit scared about what we might find in there. I've heard people say that. I don't really want to look at my mind. I'm a bit scared about what I might find in there. So that's interesting. So that's the monkey mind. And there's a meditation teacher I really like. He was saying, he talks a lot about this monkey mind, and he was saying it's important that we don't regard the monkey mind as our enemy, which is an interesting point. And also he said, that we shouldn't be scared of the monkey mind. What we really should do, the best way to deal with the monkey mind is to give it a job. So he said, the best way is to change your relationship with the monkey mind, give it a job. And the job we're going to give it is these things like mindfulness, introspection and application. And so you're sort of taking control and saying, okay, monkey mind, I'm going to take control and I'm going to be the boss, and this is what we're going to do. So that's interesting. So a few other things that I wanted to talk about. I've got a few more minutes, sorry. One thing that I think is helpful is to think about, in our culture we're taught a lot about maintaining physical health, and even from a young age at school, a lot about physical health and fitness, and so I think we're fairly clear about what we need to do to stay fit physically, and not a lot of talk about staying fit mentally. And at least not in my education, there wasn't much talk about how do you keep your mind happy and peaceful. They talk about things like go for a walk in the park or things like that. But so I think there's some interesting similarities between keeping your mind and your body healthy. So for example, with our diet, we know that if we eat certain food that our body will be healthy, and there's other foods that we need to try and avoid or minimize, and other substances, cigarettes, etc. So in the same way, we also need to be careful what we're consuming with our mind. So if we're indiscriminately consuming, like just allowing every thought to come into the mind, then it's a bit like just eating whatever food comes in front of you. So we need to be careful about what thoughts are occupying our mind, is what I'm saying. So this is where introspection is important. We need to be sort of aware what's going on in your mind, and what thoughts am I allowing to come in. And if there's thoughts that are there that are really bothering you, that are upsetting you, making you anxious, making you sad, then we have this ability to just turn them off, to think about something else, and that's mindfulness. So you move your mind to something that's going to make it positive. So it's quite similar, it's not that complicated to do that. It's just, I think, a matter of getting into the habit of doing that. And then also with exercise. So people try to do some exercise each day, have some goals, like walking a certain number of steps, etc. So in the same way, we can have exercise that we do for our mind, like meditation on the breath. So if you focus your mind on a neutral object, you get into the habit of doing that, then you're giving your mind a break, a rest, and developing these tools. And also with maintaining physical health and fitness, there's also a lot to know. There's a lot of information we can study, we can do. So in the same way with our mind. So there's so much, as I said, there's these 84,000 teachings of the Buddha that we can study. So there's so many different techniques that we can use. And as you're saying, some people like the technique of counting and others don't. So there's various techniques that we need to try out and find what works for us. So the Buddha was really encouraging people to study a lot and think about these ideas. And so you start with the ideas which relate, as I said before, to the main affliction in your mind. So say it's anger, for example. Then there's so many different practices you can use to pacify anger. There's a wonderful book called The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which has a whole chapter on dealing with anger. There's three main practices of patience that are taught in that. So you can just, each time you get angry, you can go and start reading them about them, this, and then try them. Which one works for me? What is causing my anger, and what is the solution to this cause, or the cause of this anger? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's not mysterious. Maintaining mental health and developing our mind there's certain practical things we can do. There's a lot we can do to investigate what's in our mind, what's going on and what's bothering us, and developing these positive mental habits. And it's quite practical. Okay, so we're kind of out of time. Did you have any comments or questions about that before we go? Does that sound reasonable? Anyway, have a think about these things and come back next week. And see you then. Thanks for your time.